A big part of cybersecurity planning involves penetration testing. That, in turn, requires management of the thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of endpoint devices on your network. Each one can be a source of unwanted network penetration. I discussed this in detail with the lead penetration tester for the Department of Computing Security at the Rochester Institute of Technology, Rob Olson. Mr. Olson, good to have you with us.
Hi there, Tom. Nice to be here.
And in addition to teaching students about penetration testing, what does a penetration testing person do all day?
So we get to do all kinds of really interesting, often nefarious things. We get to think, essentially, our job is to think like the bad guys do and to try and break in. And then, obviously we get hired by a company to come and break in. And then we give them a nice report that tells them how we broke in, assuming we did, and how they could stop us from doing the same thing again.
And I think there's an implicit assumption on too many people's parts that because phishing has become the major cybersecurity vector, and that's something you voluntarily click on, that old-fashioned hacking and break-in has somehow diminished, but probably has not, has it?
Honestly, it has actually a little bit. So I do agree that over the last, let's say, 5 years or so, phishing has been the dominant vector, and as we've seen security controls like two-factor authentication being deployed, that has really actually done a pretty good job at cutting down on the number of hacks that have happened. I mean, hacks are still going to happen through other kinds of means. That's probably never going to go away. But what we generally see is that threat actors move to they operate under the same sort of challenges that everybody else does, in that for many of them, this is just a job. And they're trying to do that job as quickly and as easily as possible. And a lot of times that's phishing. But if that vector doesn't work, they'll try something else.
And do you consider something successfully happening through phishing as also a penetration, and therefore comes under the general umbrella of penetration testing?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
All right, then let's talk about endpoints then, because everything ultimately starts with an endpoint. And what's the leading, technique for penetration testing and for penetration prevention these days?
Yeah. As far as stopping me, really, there's a set of well-known best practices at this point. This isn't like cybersecurity is not the Wild West anymore. That's something of a controversial opinion to take, which I can probably do because, I teach at a university rather than being in industry. I can take some of these perhaps less popular opinions since I don't have to worry about selling my products. But we know how to do security pretty well in a lot of scenarios. And that's not to say that everyone's going to be the same, but we know what, generally speaking, best practices are. We know what kinds of things work pretty well to harden endpoints. NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies, they have well-documented sets of best practices that if you follow them, you're going to be in pretty good shape. This isn't 2015 anymore. Antivirus software is pretty good. And as someone who writes malware, I red team for student competitions, volunteer to red team for student competitions where we're trying to emulate nation-state threat actors. So I kind of write some of our bespoke malware for those events. Yeah, the first thing we do is make sure that we nuke any antivirus software on those systems. Endpoint security is pretty good these days. And as long as you're following those best practices, you're going to be in pretty good shape.
And the best practices for endpoint security itself, then, how would you characterize those?
Yeah, there's a robust list, probably more than we can get into in the time frame of this show. But making sure that you have antivirus software installed on all your endpoints, making sure that is being logged and that those logs are actually being reviewed by Security Operations Center staff. Those are really the things that are going to make sure that things get stopped. And oftentimes, even if something gets through, because no security is going to ever be 100% perfect, ever. In the future of computers, we're never going to get to 100%, perfect defense. But, 99%, 98%, yeah, that's probably going to be something that's eventually achievable through what we call defense in depth, where even if we get past the two-factor authentication, the antivirus will stop you. Even if we get through the antivirus, there'll be something else that stops you. The security analyst will see something weird happening, and they'll raise the red flag that system needs to get quarantined. So what really matters is having layered defenses and having good processes around the management of those defenses.
We're speaking with Rob Olson. He's the lead penetration tester and lecturer for the Department of Computing Security at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And having all of that in place, do you also need to limit what people have for applications on endpoints? I mean, endpoints used to be considered pretty much synonymous with mobile phones and smartphones, but really endpoints are, you could define as anything on a network that's connected.
Yeah. And we are seeing some. So we do need to limit access to often those devices. In fact, one of the reasons why you don't see as much stuff happening on mobile phones these days is because they are pretty locked down out of the box. But we do have to make sure that we're hardening those endpoints, and that does sometimes mean that users might have to go through their tech support mechanisms in order to get the access that they need to do the task. So there's good reasons why you can't install software on your machines and you have to ask someone else to do it. There's really good reasons why you should not, let's say, root or jailbreak your mobile phone. This gets really interesting when we start talking about like Internet of Things devices, because that is there's a little bit more variance there in what information can be collected off of those, how you can access and how you can control them. Usually the recommendation is to try and like limit those kinds of devices, like perhaps a smart TV, which is, I imagine, the kind of thing you would see most often, the thing you would see most often deployed in an office environment is one of these smart TVs, and have that, like those kinds of devices on their own little portion of the network that is really tightly controlled and really tightly monitored. But even then, there are some really interesting problems associated with privacy around those kind of devices. So we've seen smart TVs, for example, that will essentially take screenshots of whatever it is you're viewing and then send them home for data analysis. That's just a part of the way that smart television works. So thinking about those challenges moving forward, that's probably going to be a little bit of a harder problem. But
Sure.
Otherwise, yeah, we're in pretty good shape.
And most of the world operates in some fashion wirelessly now, especially with mobile endpoint devices. But at the same token, everything eventually has to go onto copper or fiber to be processed and analyzed and whatever the end product desired would be. And there are techniques for monitoring what's going on, eavesdropping on metal wire, but also on optical cable too, and you can see the behavior of photons to know whether someone is eavesdropping. Is that part of your work, and is that part of something organizations, agencies, companies need to worry about?
So really, when we talk about how an organization should design their security controls, we talk about making sure that those organizations are developing a threat model that is appropriate for them. It's not feasible for everyone to worry about every single possible threat, right? So like for example, I'm not real worried about a foreign government trying to target me. I'm just not that interesting. Maybe I shouldn't say that on the radio, but I'm just not that interesting. No one's going to come after me, right? Federal employees, yeah, might be a different scenario. So when we think about the kinds of attacks that are associated with this, something like hard tapping an optical cable is a possible. Probably that's a little bit outside of the kind of work that I regularly do, but that's probably going to be a major investment for some threat actor. And if it's your corner coffee shop, should they be worried about something like that? No, probably not. Now, there are some places where we have seen interesting threat vectors that don't necessarily apply anymore. So one of these is there's always sort of conventional wisdom that if you're on public Wi-Fi, you should always be using a VPN. And that's something that, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, yeah, absolutely, 100%. And the reason for that is a lot of traffic on the web was not encrypted at that time, but it is encrypted